Jag mejlade till Mediasajten också.
So my name is Olle Frödin, and I'm a lecturer here at the Department of Sociology. And I'm also representing Sasnet, the network for South Asia Studies here at the university. And we are very proud to introduce Professor Ursula Rao, who's the director of the Institute of Anthropology at the University of Leipzig in Germany, who will lecture today. And this is part of, I should just say a few words before I give the word to Ursula. This is part of a seminar series on urbanization and structural transformation in South Asia. And it's also linked to our conference next year. We will organize a big South Asia conference in May 20, 2015, which is on these topics as well, urbanization and the impact on basically people's everyday life in South Asia. So Ursula, without much further ado, I think perhaps it's better that you present your very, very interesting lecture topic. So I'll give the word to you, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I usually like standing up and talking. I find it easier. What I would like to do today, it's very much, well, I can say it's almost saturated research, but at the same time it is still work in progress in the sense of that this is the place I'm talking about. It's a, I don't know, this works on this. It requires very careful handling. So here's Sabdagira. It's a suburb very much at the margins of Delhi. I will explain the details later. And what I've been doing is I've published a couple of papers, one in ethnos and one in cultural anthropology, about the initial making of this suburb. And the question of whether after the demolishing of slums within inner Delhi and the resettlement of this population on legal grounds at the margins of the city, whether that is actually leading to a legalizing of poor papers. And then I come to a mixed conclusion. It's about the negotiation of the illicit divide, what I call it. But now what I'm trying to do is moving on from there. This has now been established 6 years ago, so by now it is actually a prospering suburb. And I'm trying to understand what new light is being cast on questions of urbanization if we look at a suburb in the making. And a suburb which is coming up very quickly and shows all signs of adjustment, accommodation, but also conflict that we probably can see in overpopulated spaces. And this is where I hope for your input, because I'm just trying to find a theoretical thread through this, and I'm inspired by a new scholarship of the census, city census in the city, and kind of the sense spaces of cities in order to understand what's happening here. So one of the things that you see if you start looking closely is, for example, so here's this man. Oh no, this is sorry, I'm still trying to adjust to this technology here. So here's this guy climbing a wall. You wonder, this is an old gentleman. Why would you want to do that? And then you have, so you have all these funny things happening here. There's kind of this spillover over a wall, all kinds of wood, and then there's a little garden here. So as I became familiar with this place, and there's some advertising for water here, I was trying to understand in more depth what is happening here. Now, there you go. There you can see this little garden. There's a tree. It's a mango tree, probably. No, maybe a papaya tree. This is really sensitive technology. So this is where we are, Delhi. This is very tricky to handle. Why? They don't. Some of this.
Well, yeah, I thought it would work like PowerPoint. Is anyone familiar with this specific computer?
You have to use the buttons at the bottom that are pointed in different directions.
Yeah, no,
But that's what we're trying to do.
Okay,
I don't know why it's not working.
punch
That's how
I don't.
Okay, I just tried to run it.
No, yeah.
Okay, so here's Delhi. This is where these people used to live. Now this is the inner city. You see old Delhi railway station. This is the new Delhi. This is where the main hub of the city is, and this is where these people come from, and this is where they're living now, right? So we look at a 40-kilometer move right to the edge of the city. It's quite interesting because this is already village Delhi. Now what Delhi has achieved by moving up to 1 million people out of the inner city is that suddenly their statistics change significantly. If there were a city with 40% people living below the poverty line, now they have 20% because they all live in village Delhi and not in urban Delhi, which of course is a very strong incentive for international investors to invest in such a posh city which has only 20%, which is much below the kind of average of third world countries. This was part of the Clean and Green Delhi campaign that peaks around the Commonwealth Games. Now, this is where you see it, right? So by 2000, the planning for the Commonwealth Games in 2010 started, and you see a peak of demolishing here, and it's coming up to another peak, and then now it is actually down again. I mean, they're not really demolishing too many slums right now unless there's a particular investor who wants to use his or her territory for investment. So it is this time we are looking at. It's 1 million people losing within a few years their habitations. And this is where they're living now. Now, I shot this to give you a sense for the rural feel it has. You go to the limits of the city of Delhi, and then you travel for another 10 kilometers through fields before you actually reach. So we're really in the outskirts. But now, and this is where I started, is by now it is actually a prospering suburb. And it's actually doing the opposite of what it was intended to do. It is not actually getting people out of the city, but it's attracting new people to the city. Because if you see now how this is coming up, it is partly those people who have been resettled, but then it is attracting from the regions all kinds of people who now have the city in front of their doorstep. So what you see is it is actually attracting all kinds of people from the villages to invest in this place, which is now rapidly being urbanized. So it actually is increasing the growth rates of Delhi rather than kind of decreasing and slowing it down and just increasing the sprawl of the city. Now these are three of my colleagues who have theorized Delhi in terms of kind of three narratives that shape this development. And my study started with the question, but what happens to the poor people? Because one thing we see in the theorizing of process of gentrification is that they focus on the middle class, and the way the middle class is now cleaning up cities and throwing out poor people. So we know about the habits, about the desires, and also about the policies of powerful people, middle class people, who together kind of seem to be ganging up or having certain reasons to throw out people. But even in the academics text, those people don't figure anymore. It almost seemed as if the academic text went through the same processes of gentrification, where the poor people just they were just outside. I mean, I couldn't find them in the text, and that kind of made me go there. Now, what Amita Baviska, she's in Delhi, she has written about is bourgeoisie environmentalism. So she says that what is happening is that anti-poverty measures are justified by people claiming, blaming pollution on the poor people, neglecting the fact that it is not them creating most of the pollution simply because they use very little water, they all the resources they use very little of, but because they have no means of accessing these resources and also getting rid of dirty water. It just seems kind of as if they're polluting. But in overall terms, they are actually not polluting because they're using a tenth of the water a middle class household, only it's invisible. The pollution of middle class people is invisible, whereas the pollution of poor people is very visible. And this gives middle class people a justification to oppose poverty, and with poverty oppose poor people, and by opposing them trying to throw them out and bring them into invisibility. So it is not really about environment, it's not about pollution, but it's about making invisible, making pollution invisible. And this is, I think, a very important point I'll come back to. Now, what Arvind Rajagopal has argued is about commodity aesthetics. So what he says is poor people have a certain position. They're placed in the Indian hierarchy as providing services, but not as living or surviving. So their visibility, they come back into visibility as long as they provide the services of, of cleaning the houses, of building the streets, of supplying rations, but they're not supposed to be there with their bodies and their pollution. So commodity aesthetics means that in a certain sense, as long as they squeeze themselves within these spaces of kind of a commodity culture, their presence is acceptable, but otherwise they again have to be hidden into invisibility. And finally, then Asha Gärtner argues about governmentality. So what are then the government structures which help rendering those people invisible by, for example, generating statistics that, for example, justifies demolishing the huts of all those people who have migrated to the city after this and this deadline. So they're declared non-legal citizens and then just simply thrown out of the city. So there's a particular kind of statistical approach to poverty, which is what he says a new form of governmentality. What I think these approaches lack is a serious addressing of urban challenges. It seems that the literature is very much around the need for middle-class people to have a particular kind of the desire for a particular kind of environment. What they do not address is that these address actual real challenges of overpopulation, of depletion of resources. In other words, it just seems as if this is just a desire for posh environments, for more cleanliness, but there is a need for environmentalism, and there is also a lack of resources. Blaming it on poor people obviously is not the solution, but the question is, how are these challenges being addressed, and how are poor people, how are they vis-a-vis those challenges? And the second thing is that, I find that what is lacking is the multiple voices and the multiple agencies in this. It's a very kind of literature that discusses top-down processes of gentrification, but, I resist speaking in terms of resistance, so I don't just want to depict it as a bipolar order where there's kind of domination from top and resistance from bottom, but there's some kind of multiple agencies, and that's what I'm trying to get into focus. Now, in order to do this, I'm going back to my voices. Voices of people who are not middle class. In order to do this, I'm going back to some of the literature on urbanism around the turn of the century here in Europe. It's 1880, between 1920, this is when there is a huge crisis of urbanity in Europe. There are all these problems of slums, overcrowding, dirt, depletion of resources, unhealthy living conditions, moral decay, lack of education, everything, that seems to be kind of the battleground in India right now. And how are these being addressed? Now, I might just read this part because it's theoretically a little denser than the rest. So, concerns over the central density of urban hubs emerges as a key figure already at the dawn of the 20th century, with its rapidly changing urban spaces in Europe. In his classical studies, Zimmel, I think one can consider him the father of the anthropology of the senses. This at least the oldest I find. I mean, he's gone through each sense and then described it in relation to the city. So in his classical studies, lots of people who think in terms of slums as homogeneous spaces, as spaces of poverty. But I think unless we start understanding how extremely stratified they are and how strongly different the approach of people with no education, little education, lots of education, with no money or little money or access money is, unless we start understanding this and addressing, so currently policy seems to be addressing the people with potential for upward mobility. So those who already have a little education, those who are ready to invest in the future. So there's lots of offers for these people, kind of, to jump on the ladder, as they tend to say in policy. But there's nothing at all targeting people who just desperate, where people are drinking, where there's no education, where there's no care for children. They just left completely out of any policy at all. And I think this is the challenge of the future. To wonder, what do we do with those 30% of the poor who are not ready to climb the ladder even if you give them something, They're not ready to jump. They're not ready to climb. What to do about them? Are you just leaving them poor? Are you just leaving them to fend for themselves? And this is the same in Europe, What about those people who can't, now you get, in Germany you get unemployment dole only if you apply for jobs 3 times a month and do this and do this. But what about those people who don't do it? What are you going to do with them? What are those who do not positively react to neoliberal governmentalities? I think this is the challenge for policy.
I just wonder have you taken into this discussion the World Bank public-private partnership policy that it's been advancing very, very hard in India? Or do you go into this neoliberal policy that the World Bank is obligating its partners?
I mean, this is very much connected to, things happening in kind of global governance. I mean, partly, for example, the way this resettlement has come up is by studies through the World Bank. For example, they say if you give them plots, all they do is sell them and then move on, right? So you don't want to do that. You want to lease these things, but as you find them leasing it, everything becomes illegal again. So it seems that that the World Bank is not just simply pushing one line of kind of neoliberal governance, but they push a particular line, and then they do a study, then they push another line, but every time kind of it ends up in another illegality, because they don't address the problem of poverty. I mean, it's just not only a question of good governance, but it's one of limited resources. And that's something that's not being talked about, that no one wants to hear.
I'm thinking specifically about the water circumstance, because that is a very tangible expression of public-private partnerships that are disadvantageous for the people who are poor.
And I actually think it's a misuse of the term. I mean, what's the public in this? The public is basically just giving something to the company that they can make a profit. It is not public-private in the sense of that the public, it's given cheaper to the poor through some kind of public engagement, but it's just simply opening the public for private companies to come in. So it's the perverse interpretation of what public-private partnership could mean.
Exactly, thank you.
Yeah. You had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what was the meaning of it all, like the state or the government, they wanted to move these people and to them to make like a living for themselves and prosper in that place, or is like through liberalization, like they could make their own way? Because if they don't want them to work the land, or like what was the thought?
Well, the purpose at this point was simply to clean up the city for the Commonwealth Games. I mean, they wanted to build stadiums, they needed space, so it was about competition over urban land. At the same time as gentrification. So you didn't want to have the British Queen, kind of drive through Delhi and then have all these slums there. So some were kind of hidden by curtains, but some were just simply demolished. They kind of made all these beautiful curtains for the Queen. So that was at that point the desire. I mean, just simply clean the land, and then somehow do a lip service really to kind of anti-poverty measures by giving those people land, but giving it so far away that it was not giving them any realistic chances of. I mean, they had built the rail net, the Delhi rail net, the metro, till here, and 10 kilometers from the last stop. This is where they made those happenings. So you wonder, that if at all you have to make them outside the city, why wouldn't you want to connect them to the grid so that the people could? And in fact, after after this huge wave of slum demolishing, there was a huge a shortage of labor in the city, which then swapped the popular mood, and people said, well, we can keep doing this, but actually we don't get maids to clean the house, so they weren't happy either way, you know.
So it's almost like a simple solution to the overcrowding. Yeah.
Which is not simple at all, as you can see.
Yeah.
It's being a really complicated solution.
I think you had a question.
Yeah, I was thinking about the strategies of the people, the what you call the poor people or the weak people. I'm thinking about James Scott's. I guess you're familiar with his work on weapons of the weak here.
Yes.
And I see some links to his work on weapons of the weak. These people are not only victims of circumstances, they also have ideas, I guess, and strategies for survival, but also maybe for some kind of political resistance, even though you didn't want to use that concept. Or was I wrong?
did see a lot of ability to improvise. I didn't see, a lot of resistance in terms of, popular mobilization, except what they did do was, so there are different forms of collective activity here. One is the kind of trying to get together for the garbage or this or that. But one of the persistent forms of collective action is before the elections. So every time before the elections, the state government, the Sheila Dixit in that case, would come there and say, well, what do you want, right? And then they would pool their voices and say, well, we want a school. So she'd build a school. And then they'll vote her again. And so there's this 5-year cycle of poor people bargaining for major infrastructure investment. So you can see that happening. Every time there was election, the weeks before or the month before, there would be mobilization, and there would be a bargain of kind of what does it cost if you guys are going to re-elect me. So I think this is the only really collective activity I could observe.
Mm-hmm. What about the periods between the elections? Those periods are maybe more interesting in the long run. What's happening in between elections? We all know that politicians, try to narrow the whole political debate down to 5-year period.
Yeah, they know that, after the election, no one is interested in this place. There's kind of a blasé attitude, and people do their little own improvisations, try to get a job or do this or that, or negotiate more on an individual basis. This is just how the life cycle works there. And what I see is that, and this is why I'm calling it multiple entrepreneurialism, because everyone seems to find their own little niche. It doesn't, you can't say that this is what the poor people are now doing, But one guy, he had some experience in the hospital before, so he sees there's no pharmacy here, so he starts opening a pharmacy and becomes really rich, when before he was just a humble kind of cleaner at a hospital. But because there was absolutely no service for health, and that's what he did. And then now he's doing a certificate in some kind of health practitioner, rural medical practitioner, and thereby legitimizing what he's been doing the last 5 years, namely giving medicine against paracetamol, against fever to everyone. So I call this the kind of the 3-day medicine, which is what most of them do. They give you some painkillers and say come back after 3 days, and if it's not gone, then they send them to the hospital. Or you go to the next practitioner and get the 3-day medicine, and at some point end up in the hospital. Another person, kind of turns this thing into a garden. Another person does this. Another person does that. So they all survive. Lots of them survive. Although their situation is really desperate. But I think there's lots of resilience. I call it resilience.
So, thank you very much all for coming here. And now there is, as Ulla and I said before, some coffee and cinnamon buns. So.
Let's see how long I can go. I have so many more things I can share about this. Enabling country, right? It is experience and engagement. So they have a certain experience from the village. They can have, people from the village come in and they can engage with the territory, and suddenly you read the territory through a different lens again. You don't see it, And there's one person, she said it very lovely. Let me see whether I find the quote right now. It's about, Oh yeah, so I told Renu, I told her about what the officer said, and what does he mean by park? Do you see any park? I see fallow land. They did not even bother to sow grass, let alone planted trees. Don't parks have trees? So she reads this as open land, which we are going to make fertile. All they have given us, and in fact people will recount, they dumped us here. They hadn't even marked the plots. We were just dumped here on a normal field. And then we marked the plots, going around with the officer. We forced him to mark it, and we started bringing bricks, we started building up. This was nothing. This was a stupid carrot field, right? And we turned it into a home. So how can they now exercise authority over what this should look like? But then you have the kind of conflicting regularities, and I'll talk about this. But now access and surrender, this is where we're going, right? This is kind of the other side of this urbanity, and I'll switch up the light again to give you a bit of feeling for what is so here was the optimistic picture of these people being able to survive at the fringes because they can work the land and they can kind of imaginatively fill it with their with their fantasies of urban living. And then now you see this right here is of course there is no planning for sewage or toilets, or some people are constantly in a crisis because their houses don't have toilets. There are public toilets in each block. But how is a woman going to go at night at 9 o'clock to a public toilet? It's not possible. And besides, one can just imagine how they're falling to decay, and how they're not being cared for, how they're clogged, and how they're stinking, and how these are dangerous places for women. So people build little toilets, pit toilets, or sometimes also bathrooms in front of their houses. And then of course you have this, Right, so you have this little. So every household is dumping their, because obviously there's no kind of garbage service. So what I'm trying to do, I'm coming back now to my notion of the census. So what you have here is indeed the clashing of territory being enabled, at the same time, the very quick realization of the limited resources that are available for a totally overcrowded place. There's not enough space to dump your rubbish, there's not enough wood for everyone to collect firewood, and there's certainly not enough water for everyone to get fresh water. And suddenly what comes up is a negotiation in the middle that creates small-scale gentrification. People will say, well, this is not how we want to live, right? So NGOs jump into the queue and say, okay, let's organize this. The community can get together, everyone gets 5 rupees, we employ someone to collect the garbage door to door, and then dump it somewhere where the municipal corporation can then pick it up. But it'll cost you 5 rupees. Now some people participate, but your neighbor might not, right? So here you are paying your 5 rupees, but your neighbor is not. And this is when you very quickly realize that it's a divided society, right? And as you go through the neighborhood, this is what you see. You suddenly see a group of poor people who came together, who always were kind of slightly differentiated, because even slums have very heterogeneous population. But now the rift really goes apart. You have those people who just can't cope at all, and those who are now demanding a proper clean environment, where they have come from. They've been thrown out of the city because they were an infringement on a proper clean environment. So Green and Green Dilly grows very organically here through a crisis of urbanity. And it of course brings back to light that why these people were thrown out was partly because it was all congested, it was too much, and it always hits the pool. But this kind of the same dynamic is now shaping this suburb, and it's just unclear what is going to happen to the poor people. The most recent development is this, right? Last time when I went, I ran into these kind of clean water pump stations, and I talked to the entrepreneur who started this company, and they have put pumping stations in each block, where they pump the groundwater and then filter it through kind of various. This is actually quite high tech. It's all the software is all in the cloud, and then this pumping station is, because there's no electricity grid, there's no water connection. I mean, there's no service at all. This is kind of neoliberalism pure, right? It's just kind of everything is organically made. So So this is connected to a cloud through the telecommunication network and has a filter system which filters the water and then gives it out to people for a certain price. 30 paise per liter. 15 paise per liter. This is if you get it at the main station, you pay 15 paise and otherwise 30 paise for a liter. That's actually quite a lot of money for a liter of water. But it's the only way you can get water. Now, interestingly, the company is selling its own activity as private-public partnership. Now, what's the public in this? The public is that the public is providing land for them, giving them permission to bore the water and sell the water, and giving them assurance that the municipal corporation will not put any water grid there for the next 10 years, so that they can make profit. So this is called public-private enterprise. And they're making good money of providing clean water to people who desperately poor. So it is an extremely neoliberal, very privatized environment. But garbage collection by a benevolent NGO, is provided on a cost. Where water is provided by a corporate. So this whole thing of it's no longer clear what is social service and what is just extractive capitalism. It's both. It's social service at the cost of extractive capitalism for the purpose of making this environment livable also in year 6. And so this is what I'm seeing at this point. I mean, I probably don't have a proper theoretical conclusion, but the interesting thing here is it shows us the limits of urbanism and how the poor neighborhoods become the playing field for trying out new neoliberal ways of organizing public services. I mean, it's privatizing of public services, which is hitting these places because they're completely disconnected from the grid. And it's a process of gentrification with huge speed because it is linked to privatization, which very quickly bifurcates a society along those lines who can and want to invest, and those who cannot or do not want to invest. So there's nothing to mediate that process. There's no kind of public service that can mediate this process, which is why you see kind of a class divide erupt very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was, I must say, extremely exciting, and I think we now have time for a few questions. I already don't follow my example and interrupt in the middle of the lecture, but I couldn't help myself. I had to ask that question. But I'm sure we have questions. So we will have some time for Q&A. Unfortunately, I will have to run soon, but I'm sure we have time for another. We go on until 3 maximum. That's the deadline.
Okay.
But I don't think we'll stay till 3. But at least there's a lot of. So we have plenty of time now to.
And also, after 3 o'clock, there is some coffee and cake upstairs where we can just mingle around and continue the discussion.
Thank you, Linda, for pointing that out. There's coffee and cinnamon bun waiting for us in the lunchroom, and everyone in here is invited. So we can also continue the discussion under more informal conditions. That would probably be nicer. We don't have to sit here and raise our arms. Okay, so I'm gonna slowly. Is there anything?
No.
Do
you have any questions for anyone?
Staffan, you also.
Some question. I mean, it's a global phenomenon. This new urban economy building up high value urban property in a so-called knowledge society. So similar processes of gentrification we have here in our province, Sweden, Malmö, Lund, where it's not as brutal as the kind of slum clearance you have in Delhi, but for example, the public housing companies who were built up to provide cheap and good housing for common man has been turned into private companies with a demand on them to yield profit. And then there are a number of regulations about housing standards in terms of, say, in our part of the world, heating and so on. What we now see is that a process where affordable housing for low-income families is phased out. The housing companies in Malmö and Lund, they take decisions to simply to demolish and rebuild established urban housing complexes and offering the old inhabitants to come back to rent the same apartment, upgraded very much to maybe 2 or 3 times the original rent. We have this process also in nearby villages. Yesterday there was an article.
Question.
But my question is, have you any experience in Eastern Germany of this process of the unification, say in Leipzig and on the coast and so on?
Of course, there isn't really a housing crisis yet in East Germany because 30% of the population left the eastern part of the country. So there's kind of just lots of empty space. And in fact, these are some of the growth hubs simply because there's a space available to live in. I mean, you have a real crisis in Frankfurt or Heidelberg in the western cities, but you wouldn't have that. I mean, in Berlin it's slowly showing up, but there's still an ability to spill over into Leipzig and Dresden, cities which are not saturated at all. So, I mean, the dynamic is quite different. But I think what makes what is happening now very different from what happened 100 years ago is that 100 years ago, that's when public housing was invented. So we went through a process of standardized approaches to poverty reduction. So public housing was then suddenly built in Berlin and Paris and London. They came up in New York. And now they're all being unmade, right? And what's coming up now as solutions is kind of this multiple entrepreneurialism, both in terms of improvisation, of course, that I use a little land to grow a vegetable garden, or, I start a company to sell water. So I think why this is so important to do this research is not only because it's happening all around the world, but it seems a similar paradigmatic moment like we had 100 years ago when public housing was the answer, and now it's not. Now there's a different answer. The different answer is kind of let as many possible solutions clash with each other. And it's the clashing that we're observing, but we're not yet observing, is there a pattern that is emerging, or is it just, is the only pattern that we have rich and poor, and the poor are just continuously swept out? Or is something else coming off it? I mean, this I think is the open question at this point.
I'm just curious to know the implications of your work in terms of how we can use this research to improve the situation.
I think we can, simply recognizing that, I think there's still Zimmer that was published in 1950 develops a dystopian image of the city as a place of overstimulation and overcrowding. The shock of the growing density of the city, its vibrancy, its chaos, forces the retreat into the self. And then he describes very vibrantly how people are packed into these public transports and how they learn to change bodily habits of, kind of gazing down. I once did an experiment with students where they had to write a sound diary. And it was quite interesting. I asked him to make a sound diary of the homes and of their travels to and back from university. And one of the paper reported that he found it extremely challenging because for the first time he was traveling on the bus without his headphones, and he heard all these things, and he felt so infringed upon. He just hated that experience so much. He said, "I will never do this again. I will always listen to music. This world is so noisy." And it seemed to a little bit replicate what Zimmer must have, what he described, as this kind of city that is encroaching on you, and how people now change their bodily habits to adapt to this to these packed places. And he calls it then the attitude of blasé. It becomes a precondition for survival in these packed spaces. Benjamin illustrates the movement ambivalent surrender. He, of course, has this theory of the flaneur. Now, it's very interesting. The flaneur is this person who now enjoys kind of the boulevard and all these gentrified places, which are almost like a living space, an inside turn outside, so that the city becomes almost like your interior home. You know, there's all these kind of furnitures, the beautiful shops, the shop windows. But if you read very carefully, then he also describes the flaneur as someone who's intoxicated. So the ability to live in that space is because you are like a man drunken. You're not in your full senses. It's only under these conditions that you can actually enjoy this kind of crazy condition. So there's a centered re-education that is required. Now, contemporary centrist studies show that how such concerns over dangerous density and vibrancy of the city animate reform that change the sensescape of the city. So in other words, what now policy is doing is trying to intervene into that space in order that sane living becomes possible. And one can describe it as a process of central thinning out, which is polishing and deodorizing and making invisible. And this is the point I want to get back to, the making invisible. And here I thought El-Khoury's work is extremely helpful. He compares 200 years ago the movement from kind of these urban spaces without sewage. This is kind of like a traditional marketplace from here to there, right? Paris, Haussmann's Paris. What is that kind of movement? Such an urban transformation is not merely a result of a changing aesthetics. At the turn of the 20th century, the world experienced a profound shift in classificatory practices pertaining to the application of clean, unclean opposition of urban spaces. The individual physical and the urban social body are seen to be under attack by substances rendered legible through modern science, thus motivating technological innovation for social and environmental improvement. Success manifests as an absence of stench, noise, and visual congestion. Such removal of dirt through the eradication of central signs are both informed by and contribute to recalibrating central perceptions, shifting the border between positive and negative stimuli, and poses the presence of unwanted smells and sights. Now, the interesting thing here is that the smells and signs are read as signs of dangerous substances, as in feces, as in bacteria, so what science now does is it makes legible a particular kind of, the whole science of hygiene, of course, becomes kind of underlies. So in other words, when we say we have a transformation of the sensescape, then beneath that is a whole science that tells us that this sensescape stands for something dangerous that encroaches on the body. That are bacteria, but that is also, for example, in Vienna, where they invented first noise pollution. So 100 years ago, suddenly people felt it was noisy, and it became noisy because it became measurable, and by becoming measurable, you could regulate it. So a whole set of policies were invented, so that today, when we are trying to eradicate kind of those signs of central density, it has this kind of whole kind of underbelly of scientific thoughts. And then, of course, what you have is a repetition of this in contemporary phases of gentrification. Now, this is Barcelona, a very interesting study by Montserrat. So eradicating, you see again how this becomes kind of an intervention into the sense space, eradicating the recent tangible past, decay and the smells, the dirt, that have covered a valuable history of place, and then transforming this decaying landscape into a future image of promotional brochure. So this is how she sums up what gentrification does to El Raven in Barcelona. Thin it out in terms of kind of smell and central density, and then you get a proper healthy environment. There's a lovely paper by Joshua Komarov. He's the son of the famous Komarovs, who works as an architect in Singapore. And he says, so Singapore is the most gentrified city where, gentrification is not only that you eradicate smells and sounds and create a pleasing, empty environment, but at the same time that you manage ethnic diversity and class diversity. But at the same time, what he then says is the most haunted word in this most haunted city in the world, where you have all ghosts all over the place. So one thing he specializes in is making houses in sites that remain empty. For example, there is a very valuable space in the city where no one is building anything, and then he investigates what's happening there. And usually there's some ghost story. There's someone who died, or there's an empty lawn, and there are ghosts attacking. So he then, kind of gets priests in to help kind of get rid of the ghosts, and this is how he makes accessible urban spaces. So in other words, what he seems to be suggesting is that as we eradicate all these things, somehow the word encroaches back up on us. That the making of invisible is not the eradicating of. And I think this is my point. My point is that while these studies, as much as the gentrification processes, kind of try to make invisible, pollution and poverty and overcrowding, it creeps back into the city. And how this is now being negotiated, the desire to get under control, and at the same time the creeping back in of the real, that I think we can observe in the suburb in the making, which I'm observing it, and this is where this article is trying to go. It is a little quote from Komarov. His article is just one of the most brilliant pieces I've read in my life. I can really recommend it. I'm happy to give the reference. Okay, so we're back here. Now the first thing you notice is looks a bit like a village. You have these kind of mud cakes. These cakes, and then you have cows here, and you have wood stacks here. Should we for this part just switch off the light just a little bit so that you can appreciate it better? Oh, is that causing trouble with your recording?
No, that's why I just need to fix the white balance.
So there's a certain village feel to this. People are spreading onions to dry them. And they're making these little kind of outside little ovens where they can cook food. Now what's happening here is that, I might read this one quote which is lovely from one of the bureaucrats. These people have no civil sense. Look at the resettlement colony. We have given them park in each block. Every colony needs a park for people to walk and kids to play. But what do? All they can think of is to encroach on the land. It is their fault that they live in such congested, unhealthy, filthy conditions. Now this quote from a senior bureaucrat, of course, reads all these kind of activities and encroachment of public land. And equipped kind of with this quote, I go through the colony and you can just make a list of encroachments, right? Encroachment in terms of wood stacks, in terms of drying, in terms of public cooking, in terms of, you see this is a little park and someone has turned it into a garden. So I asked him, so how come he can run a garden there? Isn't there anyone opposing it? And said, he's poor, he's a mullah. And I said, he's poor, he's a mullah, but maybe everyone wants to have a garden. And I couldn't, extract more information at that point. And later I went around and found out that he has actually very close connections to the kind of Muslim mosque and the priest there, so that he has the kind of the backing of the authorities to be able to make his garden there. So you have this little garden there in public space. You have this encroachment, of course. Just give you bigger. Now the first thing that happens is as you move into this colony, you're given a list of rules. What you cannot do. You cannot grow anything. You cannot hold animals. And you have to build something on your plot. It has to be in hutment, and you have to live there personally. Now people breach all these laws, and they breach them because they at this point are desperately poor. I mean, they lose their income. They live 40 kilometers outside the city. They have no means of access to the labor market, and at the same time, they have to invest in a house. So their priorities is shifting from, they would say, we came for work to the city, not for housing. Housing was always secondary, but now housing is made by the state is saying, unless you prioritize the way you live, you do not have the right to the city, and with that, no right to the labor market. So, it's kind of the flip side turned around. And now this is what they're trying. They're trying to make a house a priority. And they do this by investing in the landscape. And what they see is, they said, see, if it had any advantage moving, here we have air, we have the land, we can work the land. So they go back to a more of a village mode of functioning here, where they collect the wood, they make little stoves, they get grains from the village, they dry the grains, they store them. In other words, they have resources, both in terms of skills as in terms of networks, that enable them to survive in a situation where no person could survive because they actually don't have any proper income. And so landscape becomes enabled. Was there someone asking a question?
Well, I was wondering, so they have proper sort of legal titles. Can they prove ownership of these plots? Or?
This is a little complicated because the ownership is given to you on a 10-year lease.
Okay.
And after 10 years, no one knows what happens. It should be around now next year. We're going to see. But see, this is what I write about in the 2 articles which I've published. It is that every time I went to a house, I said, can you show me your plot papers? Then this was, let's say this was Mr. Kumar, right? And then he came with a paper and it read Mr. Gupta. And I said, well, this is Mr. Gupta. No, what happened is that actually that time I didn't have the money, so he lent it to me, and then he bought this property for me, but before I can buy it back from him, I first have to pay this debt with him now, and then eventually he'll return it. So in other words, even the rich people didn't have proper titles, right? Others had done all kinds of other, everyone had improvised around these titles because there was no way of building a house without funds. But to get funds, you had to kind of do some kind of trading around these papers. So even if 30% of those people who live there are still original allottees, probably not more. I mean, all the rest would have left because they just, they couldn't survive in these circumstances. But even those 30%, they don't have titles in in any proper legal sense.
But they're still investing, despite the fact that they're...
This is what I'm saying. It's kind of it's a high risk thing, right? It's a high risk thing, and that's why I call it kind of entrepreneurialism, or rampant entrepreneurialism.